That's a real tongue twister for me, I'm sorry. Omar El Akkad, Yasmin Abdel-Magied, in conversation with Ishan Tarour. Take it away.
Well, thank you all for being here. Good afternoon. My name is Ishan Tarour. I'm a foreign affairs writer at the Washington Post, where ever since the inauguration of our 45th president, for my sins, I've been writing a daily column on where Washington meets the world. I've not had very much to write about in the past few months. And as I'm sure you can understand, Patriot games is a concept I'm playing around in my head every day. So just to put it plainly, to set the scene for you, the overarching story of the last year, political year in the West, has been this narrative of the return of the return, or maybe even the revenge of the nation state. Beginning with the British vote for Brexit, obviously Donald Trump's election. Were there any doubts that history had not ended, to use the Fukuyama phrase? It was certainly put to rest in November. And instead, we've seen that some of the neoliberal policies that have underlaid 20 years of globalization have brought us to a kind of moment of political and even perhaps intellectual crisis in the West. And then, in the last year, you've seen elections in France, in the Netherlands, where far-right populist parties were stalled, but at the same time, we have to reckon with this reality now where once profoundly obscure neo-fascist political movements command unprecedentedly large vote shares and seats in parliament. In 8 days' time, in Germany, you will see very likely, and in Germany, which is, of course, supposedly now the last liberal bastion of the international order, you will see a party that is frustrated by having to apologize for the Nazi past, a far-right anti-immigrant party, quite likely become the third biggest political force in the country. So that's the broader political scene. Of course, moving further east from Poland to Hungary to Erdogan's Turkey to Modi's India, there is an overarching narrative also in play in recent years where a majoritarian nationalist politics has supplanted the politics of inclusion that perhaps people who attend such wonderful settings as a literary festival in Boulder, Colorado, appreciate. Steve Bannon, the erstwhile Trump ideologue, has said that he looks at Egypt and India as fertile territory for his far-right website, Breitbart, which is really a sign for the times. So in that context, I've naively grown up in New York City, always considering myself a citizen of the world. And now we live in an era where, as the British Prime Minister Theresa May said, if you consider yourself a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. And so this is to put it crudely, this is the political moment that we've arrived at now. I have a fascinating, wonderful panel here who I hope will help me explore this with much more sophistication. So just to give you a quick rundown, you can see their bios in the programs. Of course, those bios are also available online. To my immediate right is Devesh Kapoor, a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the director of the Center for Advanced Study of India at that university and the author of numerous books on India, migration, and Indians abroad. Next to Devesh is Yasmin Abdel-Magied. She, according to her bio, is a mechanical engineer, a social advocate, writer, and petrol head, which you'll have to explain because I have no idea what a petrol head is. And she's a...
I like fast cars.
Oh, okay, thank you. It's an Australian thing, perhaps, I don't know. She is a debut author at 24 with a coming-of-age memoir called Yasmin's Story, and she's a very interesting, unique champion of diversity politics, if I can put it that way. We have Mukund Padmanabhan next to Yasmin. He's an accomplished journalist, a former lecturer of philosophy, and the editor-in-chief of The Hindu, which I think, to my mind, and surely to many others here, is probably far and away the best English language daily in India. Next name is Kehan Irani, who is an Emmy Award-winning writer, producer, and artist, whose works are engaging with questions of immigration and citizenship and belonging, and whose work has been feted by the Obama administration, presumably not the current one. And if you look at the program, she's also clearly the most overextended participant at the festival.
I told him I'm the lit it girl.
5 panels. And next to Kehan is Omar El-Akkad, Canadian-Egyptian author and award-winning journalist. He's covered a whole geography of upheaval from the Arab Spring to the Black Lives Matter movement. And this year, in spring, this spring, his first book came out, or first novel came out, called The American War. It's a fascinating novel, imagining a not so distant future where America is torn apart by civil strife related to phenomena of climate change. And I'm sure he'll tell us a bit more about it. So I just wanted to kick off our conversation, and I'm very eager to get audience involvement as well. With Professor Kapoor to my right, in this moment when globalism and cosmopolitanism has become a kind of almost pejorative word in some sense, can you talk a bit about the evolution of the discourse on nationalism that we are reaching right now? There was a moment not so long ago where people were talking about the end of the nation state. People were talking about all the kind of other ways that we're connected in a very interdependent world. That seems to be now no longer in vogue. What's happened?
It's on you.
Oh, yeah, okay. So I think one is to ask ourselves if we deceived ourselves in believing that the nation state had ever gone away. As someone, those of us who don't have the right passports, each time you go, you know the nation state never went away. The forms you had to fill out were always onerous. They might have become more onerous. It was always there. I think the interesting thing to ask is, why has this resurgence come across so many countries across the world, right? In the West, the supporters of Brexit in the US, as you mentioned in Europe, the Poland and Hungaries, which fought off a form of totalitarianism and now again seem to be seeping back into a form of authoritarian governments, as you said, Turkey, India, very much so, China. Now, one is that, of course, my nationalism will breed your nationalism. I mean, I think that is always the case. It's rarely the case that you have only one and don't have a reaction from somewhere else. On something that I've been working on, which is sort of different from what's happening here, I mean, there are sort of two types of things. One is a nationalism that is being directed outwards. In Asia, for instance, what I call the Asia's hierarchies of humiliations are driving a form of nationalism. So China has this narrative of century of humiliation, which is driving the nationalism inside China, and that is directed at the West and Japan. But China forgets that Vietnam and India have their forms of a hierarchy of humiliation against China. India forgets that Pakistan has a hierarchy of humiliation, what India did to it in '71. Pakistan forgets there's a hierarchy of humiliation from Afghanistan vis-a-vis what Pakistan has done. So these ones are directed more outwards. But there's the other form of, which we are seeing in the US, UK, and India, which is directed inwards, right? Which is this nationalism, which is a much more ethnic nationalism, which is about saying, the body politic is corrupt, it must be cleansed, and there are all these elements that it must be cleansed of. Usually it's, of course, minorities. So these are two sort of different types. Now, why they have evolved at roughly the same time? In part, you could argue that, nationalism has this curious thing like religion. It's a force that is also driven by intense idealism, and it's a force that also leads to intensely dismal outcomes. I think the writer Murakami captured it well when he said, it's like having a lot of cheap liquor. You drink it fast, you go on rampages, and then you have an incredible hangover, and then you realize what the rampage and the damage that has been done. And it's plausible, I think, as some people have argued, that it's a time in which there is what one calls the era of great disruptions. And it's not just globalism. In fact, technology might be a much bigger source of the disruption, of which what we call global integration is a part of that. And I think when people are unsettled, they look for moorings. And religion and nationalism are like anchors in an unsettled world for people who feel unsettled.
So talking about the way people feel unsettled and anchored, Yasmin, if I can turn to you. In the US after Trump's election, there's been this big ongoing debate about the question of identity politics, about the fact that, oh, you liberals in your cities were too focused on multiculturalism and pandering to people's sense of their own niche identities, and you didn't see the concerns of some broader, inchoate, white working class, or whatever you want to call it. Do you think that's a fair critique? And if it isn't, is there a positive form of identity politics that's worth defending and talking about?
I love it when people tell me that identity politics has gone too far. Because my question is often, what is identity politics to them? They'll be like, oh, you talk about your race all the time, you talk about your gender, it's so boring, right? But here's the thing, we all have identities. When we talk about politics without the identity in front, all we're talking about is white male politics, but we don't point it out as white male politics because it's the norm, right? And so all we're doing is equalizing voices. That's how I see it, right? And I think in just picking up something Devesh said, it is a time of disruption. And there's this great quote that I think about, which is, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen, right? And I feel like we're living through those weeks.
Tell me about it.
Like every week there is some, it's like whether it's Russian collusion or something else, it's a fascinating time, and the question is, we are still in the eye of the storm, right? It's when you're in it, you can't necessarily pick which trends are going to win. You can't necessarily pick which direction it's going to go. And all we can do then is try to point to what things are happening that seem significant and put energy in what we think should win out, essentially. So the sort of trends that I think are interesting are, firstly, the fact that ideas are no longer given the legitimacy they always had, right? So growing up, the neoliberal order was seen as it was seen as so natural that you couldn't even question it. The idea of questioning capitalism, the idea of questioning that the market solved everything, that was outrageous. You would be thrown out. Now people at the Washington Post, at the New York Times, are asking the same question, which is fascinating, right? So the ideas that we took for granted as the ultimate truth 20 years ago are being challenged. That, I think, is really fascinating, because we're now having a debate about big ideas, about big frameworks, about big systems, the way our systems and structures are made up, in a way that I haven't seen before in my short lifetime, and I haven't read about before in the sort of post-colonial world, perhaps. The other interesting thing is that voices of those who, like my voice, has been allowed to be here, not because I was legitimized through any mainstream media, but because of social media. My platform has been built on the internet, right? My initial sort of claim to fame was walking out of some author's speech and writing about it on a blog post, which then got picked up by mainstream media. One of the reasons I'm a national outrage in my home country is because I wrote something else on Facebook that became a national outrage for months and months and months. And so people like me who did not used to have access to mainstream and who continue to be locked out of mainstream conversations are able to somehow infiltrate on different platforms. Now, something that I worry about in this the technological disruption thing, something I worry about a lot, is the fact that we must remember that yes, we are still being able to disrupt conversations through these platforms, but these platforms are still owned by a small group of people that look exactly the same as the people that have owned everything else for the last 50 or so years. That worries me, because the strings are still being pulled by the same types of power. And that's another thing that I think we should be aware of and thinking about and talking to. And then I think, you know, the question around nationalism and the nation state, the reality is that us as humans will always hold on to some sort of tribe, some sort of identity. Pre the national state, it was, you know, tribal or it was faith-based, but we have always tried to find groupings through which to belong. The nation state was something the Brits and the French and the Portuguese decided, for my part of the world anyway, and I was born in Sudan, so even though I have an Australian passport, I was a little bit worried coming to America. You know? I got lucky that I got the citizenship that I did. And so, like, thinking about the importance of the nation state, I think, sort of sits with me in the same conversation as the fact that we will always want to belong to a group. The more important question is how we see our group in relation to others, and how we see the history of what one group has done to us in relation to others, how willing we are to forgive. And it is in a time of disruption, I think this is the time when we don't need managers of countries. We need actual visionary leaders, right? This is the time where people who can ask us to aspire to be better can make a difference. Because when everyone's doing okay, when everyone's doing good, it doesn't really matter. But when people are feeling unsettled, feeling disrupted, some idea to hold on to that is aspirational can make an enormous difference.
Great. Mukund, so Yasmin made this good point that we are still somewhat under the eye of the storm right now. Sitting in India, what does that storm look like to you? And as somebody who represents a very historic, traditional, pre-internet publication, you appear on this thing called paper, and that's printed with ink. And do you feel also a kind of disruption in motion as well in the social and political climate that does exist in India?
Yeah, I just maybe start a little differently. I just look at nationalism versus globalism, and I just feel maybe it's a false binary. I mean, you could be a globalist and not be at odds with notions like sovereignty or identity, which Yasmin spoke about. So I think what's playing out in parts of the West, Devesh mentioned Brexit, America and so on, is, I mean, you have this debate on nationalism versus globalism. I think in India, the debate is playing out in a sort of related but slightly different fashion. It's basically nationalism versus some perceived sense of anti-nationalism, if you like, or hyper-nationalism between some perceived, sense of anti-patriotism, which is like. I don't think the debate is playing out in quite the same way. I'll just come back to the journalistic question in a bit. I see lots of articles, comparing, say, Trump with Modi, which is one of the things that people keep writing about all the time. And yes, maybe there are some similarities that, between them. Both of them, I think, or there is a kind of nationalism which is growing in the world, and I think which harks back to some imagined past. I mean, Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," is a reflection of the past. I think the BJP and Modi also believe that, India was probably a greater place once than it's, been now, thanks to certain historical events, maybe some, invasions from the northeast or whatever. I think the attitudes to a kind of political Islam probably are not very different. You want me to hold this closer? Yeah, sorry. Some similarities there as well, I think. What else? I'm sure there are other things that link them to each other. But one moment. Let me think. Okay. But I think there are differences as well. I mean, you know, the huge differences. I mean, when it comes to the position of globalization, if it means interconnectedness, the kind of insularity that you see, or, you know, which Brexit represented, which Trump represents, it doesn't play out the same way in India. I mean, we are for a greater interconnectedness. We have completely different positions on things like outsourcing and jobs and so on. And yeah, talking about jobs, another similarity is that there is a similarity between, say, Modi's Make in India, which is really basically about creating jobs in the manufacturing sector, and Trump's call for, say, you know, jobs for Americans. I mean, both of them are predicated on this idea that you create jobs in the manufacturing sector for its people. But on the position of globalism, I see great differences. I mean, you know, so I still feel that we need to analyze these things at a granular level and to point out differences where they exist and similarities where they exist. I think what's happening in the world has got different shades to this. And I think between India and the rest of the world, you can see similarities on the nationalism front, but I think there are vast divergences when it comes to this issue of our positions vis-a-vis globalism. As a journalist, you know, I mean, I read what's happening in America, and I see the press, you know, being, you know, criticized every other day by the president. We don't face that kind of pressure, really. You know, I haven't faced. I mean, we are not a paper I think the government would be very happy with, but I don't think I've had anyone, you know, call me up or you know, come down on me.
No one calls you the failing Amazon Hindu on Twitter.
No. No.
Kehan, so if I can bring in the two more direct artists in the panel, your work, your theater and other projects engage with issues of identity, issues of immigration and belonging. How has the current moment, or in recent years, how has that affected your work? And what for you do you notice as you go about your projects in this moment? I mean, is the space for this kind of theater changing? Tell us a bit about where you're at.
I think people are gravitating towards more storytelling, diverse storytelling, understanding the multiple perspectives that they knew existed, but really almost as a sense of civic duty, seeking it out to say, where have I failed to listen and understand what's going on? And they go to the storytellers, and they go to literature festivals, and they go to theater and poetry and live events. So I think it's growing, and I think the arts community is also stepping up in different ways, and I think we should step up even more. My work reimagines a performance space and a theatrical space as another space for civic dialogue, as a civic convening space. You know, here you have all these people in the room wanting to understand something. You know, whether it is a family drama or whether it is a political drama, they're coming out to understand something more about something. And so there you have the potential to change it, and my work engages the audience, and my work says, okay, well, so what do you think now? And literally come on stage very often. So I think that the art spaces, because our civic discourse spaces are shrinking and cracking and fraying, that the art spaces become that space for people to do it. And the arts community, cultural community really needs to step up and say, okay, we're gonna hold the space. We want to, so let's hold it. And yes, my work deals with identity and migration, immigration, but really it deals with what's undercurrent of this dialogue is really ideas of domination and subordination. Really, for me, it's so interesting every time you have a resurgence of nationalism or a resurgence of control, government control, political control, you have narratives and you have stories that are brought back from, you know, wherever to justify that. And it has been that way historically. We have seen when we talked this morning with Paulo in the session about 1001 Arabian Nights, really looking at how colonizers were using stories and using these stories of the East and of the Orient to position themselves as cultural capital holders, as ways in which they were dominant because they could tell these stories, because of course these other people couldn't tell these stories. They didn't even know these stories existed in their own context. And so narrative and the way we use arts and the way we bring out narrative also fuses with ideas of domination and who should be in control, because we can tell the story better and we know the story and our story is more interesting. But of course you always, again, you look at the concealed stories and you know that these discourses were always happening. So you have narrative and who controls it and who is using it and who is creating narrative. And then you have the discourse around narrative. How do we talk about how we're talking about stuff, you know? And so historically individuals have always been in conversation with each other about complex issues and about life and about imagination. And so it's really, for me, the arts and narrative have to bring this out as well. Where, you know, how have we always been globalized in our dialogue and in our trade and in our discussion? But again, how does power and the desire to control actually attack, you know, the social relations that we have? We have to have an other in order to have a powerful force say, you know, I'll protect you from the other. And so post 9/11, we've really seen that narrative in the Arab, South Asian, Muslim communities in the crosshair of that narrative as being othered and being allowed to be the locus of attacks, both verbal and physical. And so that's kind of the work I do, is we bring, you know, like, let's lay bare these values of white supremacy that no one really believes in anymore, but we're hooked into them. We're hooked into them through the stories that we're told about ourselves, our people, and about other people. We're hooked into them about stories that we're told about, you know, what a nation looks like or should look like, or how a nation is constructed responsibly. And so we have to tell new stories to unhook ourselves from them, because we know they're no longer serving us, but we can't figure out, you know, why am I still dragging this dead thing along with me? Like, how did it get tied to my ankle? I don't know. But it is in these narratives and the culture that it comes along. And so we have to use culture to, you know, just kick that shit off.
Omar, your novel imagines a future American Civil War. Can you, I mean, especially in a year where, and it came out in a year when, in a rather surreal way, we're relitigating the Civil War in protests over Confederate statues and the debates surrounding that, very loaded political conversations surrounding that. So tell us a bit about your book and how you feel it echoes right now in the present moment.
So one of the fun things you get to do when you're an author is invent a very clean mythology and origin story for how your book came about well after the fact. And so I'm about to tell you mine. It's almost entirely apocryphal, but I have a very vague recollection of, this was many years ago, this was near the start of the NATO-led invasion of Afghanistan. I was watching this interview with a foreign affairs expert, a talking head, you know, one of these people they bring in to periodically explain the world. And this interview was happening in the immediate aftermath of a set of protests in a number of Afghanistani villages against the US military presence in particular. And the question that was put to this gentleman was something along the lines of, why do they hate us so much? And as part of his answer, he noted that sometimes the special forces have to go into these villages and conduct nighttime raids looking for insurgents. And when they do this, they will sometimes ransack the houses or hold the women and children at gunpoint. And then he helpfully added, and you know, in Afghan culture, that sort of thing is considered very offensive. And I thought, you know, name me one culture on earth that wouldn't consider this sort of thing offensive. And that's when I first had this idea of essentially transposition. You know, the central gimmick of my novel is I take things that happened very far away and I recast them as close to home. What I wanted to do was to take the central conflicts that have defined the world in my lifetime, and these are conflicts in which US involvement has either been indirect or from a great distance, and recast them as something very close to home. And I couldn't think of anything more close to home than a civil war when you're fighting yourself. But I never intended this novel to be about America. This novel was about the universality of revenge and the way that damage begets damage, which is to say that those people all the way over there don't suffer from an exotic response to injustice. You know, the way they respond to being on the losing end of a war is not fundamentally different from the way we would respond. We just have the privilege of living in a part of the world that hasn't been bombed to death for 30 years straight. And so fundamentally, it wasn't a novel about America so much. It just had to be set in America to say what I wanted to say. So I started writing this thing in the summer of 2014. I finished the first draft almost exactly a year later, summer of 2015. About 2 or 3 weeks after that, Donald Trump announced he was running for president. And suddenly, it became an American novel. Suddenly, it came out in April of this year. And almost the entirety of the reaction to it in this country has been about this idea of whether it's a cautionary tale or whether I was trying to predict where the country is headed. None of that is true. Not only could I not predict where we would be right now, I can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow at this point. Not only that, if I had predicted the present situation and tried to write it exactly into a novel that I then tried to sell back in 2015, I would have been turned away from every publisher in the country. They would have told me to tone it down. So in that sense, it's been a very surreal experience to have this novel come out in which I try to talk about the universality of revenge and instead have it be taken as this stab at prophecy, which it absolutely isn't. And I think the reason that's happening is not because my fiction is particularly prescient. I think it's because reality is slowly trying to intrude on the fictional, which is a very strange and terrifying place to be.
So I'm going to ask thank you. I'm going to ask a few questions that, given the size of our panel, I hope, just it's a free-for-all, so just jump in whenever you feel like answering. And then we'll, turn to the audience. So about this idea of the universality of the political impulse towards revenge, which is very much on display right now, whether you're in India or Turkey raging against secular elites, or in the US raging against cosmopolitan elites, or elsewhere. How sustainable is this kind of politics? How long does it last? Is it something that burns out over time, like the cheap liquor that we were talking about?
I think, for me, what I find interesting is I do think it's a revolt against elites. What I find interesting is that in India or in the US, many of these people who support the BJP or Trump are from the working, classes. In the past, we would have expected these to be the natural petri dish for support for the left. Where has the left vanished? I think, to me, that's the biggest puzzle in all this. The conditions were everything one studied in the past. When these conditions were there, that a tiny elite was sort of raking it in, etc. There was a revolt by the masses. It was always, that was how the left got built up. Then there is no left. The left has left. And exactly why that has happened, what is the bankruptcy of the left in ideas, in organization, to meet these challenges? Because the group that is sort of behind these revolts, in India, what is interesting, I think there is one big difference between the US and India. If you take the top 3, 4 leaders of India, the president, the vice president, and the prime minister, they've all come from incredibly underprivileged backgrounds. In fact, you could say this is the complete triumph of the democracy, that people with such underprivileged backgrounds have made it right to the top and are very right-wing. And how does one understand that paradox? And I think we don't really understand that paradox. And partly, I think, what is it that the left did not give them that space? Because the left was captured much more by anglicized elites in India, where people who did not speak English well, who had thick accents, felt they had no space. And I think that, to me, is something that one must ask both for the US and for India.
It's interesting, there has been this conflation of economic nationalism, what you would think is the bread and butter of left politics, and cultural nationalism, which is the bread and butter of the far-right politics. In the US, it's been this incredibly incoherent mix that you see in Trumpism, and it's working in different ways elsewhere as well. I think you can argue in India that the cultural nationalism has come out much more than the economic nationalism, and so too in the US as well.
I want to add something to that. I can't speak for the Indian experience, but I read an analysis recently that I thought was pointed to something very interesting, which is the obsession of the left talking about, losing the white working class and so on and so on. And putting alongside that the fact that the black working class and the black poor and the marginalized people of color in the country have always, have not had space in either the left or the right. And there was no question of, well, what about the people of the black working class or the black poor? Because in the conversation, it is okay for the poor of color to remain poor and to remain unaddressed. But when the white working class, when their needs are no longer met, well, clearly there's something wrong, which I think is an intersection of race in the conversation that often gets sort of lost or forgotten or not pointed out enough, because the place of the person of color at the bottom, that is natural in that conversation. The place of the white at the bottom, that is unnatural and needs to be repaired. And therefore it is okay, we can understand why they would vote for someone who essentially aligns themselves with white supremacists, because they can't get jobs. But when we look at the struggles, the incarceration rates, the police brutality, all of the things that happen to the people of color working class, we cannot understand or abide by their response. And that to me speaks of what I talk about when I say when I talk about identity politics. It is pointing out the differences in experiences for people and saying, what is it that we are assuming to be natural? What is the natural order we assume? And why do we not point that out enough?
So it would be remiss of me, because it's in the panel literature, we haven't really talked about globalization as an idea. If we accept that globalization, insofar as it represents a kind of neoliberal status quo that's existed for the past couple of decades, that it's in crisis, what can redeem it?
Right now, it looks ironically like China. I mean, I was there a few months ago and I was listening to some official speeches, and it's extraordinary. They seem like, this is exactly the point. I mean, I think our traditional notions of what is left and what is right seem to have completely collapsed. And I mean, you talked of Germany, but I think it's, I think some of these are being tied up to what is in a country's, self-interest. And the Chinese are extremely worried by what's happening in the United States and where this might go, Brexit, all of that. I think the economic future depends on this interconnectedness economically. And they sound like the loudest proponents of globalization at the moment. So which is interesting because, you talk of globalization and its, discontents. Who's discontent with it now? Not the people Stiglitz thought were its discontents many years ago.
So I think we put lots of darts on the board. I'd love some questions right now. You sir in the front, and please identify yourself if you can as well.
Yes, my name is Jay. I'm from Colorado here, from Indian background. I know that Mukund was trying to address some similarities and differences, and he was pondering on it, and while he was talking, I was thinking, and I said, I should point out a few, because I was thinking in my head, between Trump and Modi of India. The similarities are obviously they both pander to their bases. One thinks that the immigrants in the US are a threat to the white majority, whereas in India, the thought there is that the minorities somehow are to blame for all the evils and the issues that they have in India. So that is one similarity. Other similarity is one loves to tweet, and the other one loves the holograms and selfies. Maybe in the differences, I think he has 3 wives and the other one is just a bachelor. And also, one more huge big difference is Trump comes from a very elite real estate background. He was born a billionaire, whereas Modi started his career very humbly, and that I think that's a major difference.
Okay, thanks. Questions, please. You, sir. Just the gentleman there. You can try to yell. Great.
All right, thank you very much. You know, you had an interesting question when you mentioned, you know, do you feel like the alt-right movement, the white supremacist movement in America right now is sustainable, or is it going to burn itself out? And you know, one thing I would love to just say is it's probably best for anybody who cares about America right now just to assume that it's not going to burn itself out, and it's just going to get worse and worse. We actually just need to do everything that we can in our power to destroy it as soon as possible. And just don't ask mild questions like, is it going to burn itself out anymore? I mean, because it's not. We have to fight it. We actually do. We have to fight it and kill it and let it, and think of it as the most powerful thing that is out there right now, and fight it like it is, and just kill it. And then, you know, just kind of talking about some of the stuff with the elite or the working class, raising of these issues that kind of led to the rise of Trump. All of that stuff was funded by billionaires and everything. The messaging of that stuff was funded by billionaires, just like. Oh, okay. Well. There's really no question.
I want you to ask a question.
Okay. Yeah, the question. Okay, well, then the question would be: do you guys agree that you shouldn't think about this stuff as just a simple problem to talk about and something that just needs to be fought on both the physical side and the money side?
Okay. A few more questions.
Join the Democratic Socialist of America.
Gentleman here, right next to you.
Are we going to take a bunch of questions and then, all right.
Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering what...
Yes, it is. I think it is.
Okay, yeah, it is. I was wondering what the panel thinks of multiculturalism as an identity in itself. And both in India and here is hope for, I'm from California, and I've seen what's happened there over the last 20 years. And I think there's hope for that as a national identity.
Any more questions? The gentleman right behind, right in the back.
It's a very nice discussion. My question is that when you talk of all this globalization and nationalization, you talk more in the context of economy. But how about more important problems like climate change and environmental pollution, nuclear bombs, etc.? So where does that enter in the debate on nationalism and globalization?
Okay, we'll take one more question, and then I'll turn to the panel.
Any women in the audience have questions? Not that I'm focused on gender or anything.
I was just looking for...
Well, since Trump is an existential threat to all of us, when does globalism reach a point where people in the world take action against the politics of a single country?
All right. I have a bunch of overlapping questions. Oh, should we take one more question? Right there in the front. Thank you.
My dad hates it when I do that.
Globalization has actually played out more as a way of the rich countries extracting resources or moving waste or sending low-paying jobs abroad. where is globalization actually relevant in the big picture, and why are we worried about it? Nationalism with borders coming back, that's worrisome, but why are we worried about, I mean, we've got satellites floating around, everybody can look down and see things are borderless. So I'm kind of concerned about the panel looking at globalization and being an endangered idea when it really was not meant to help the globe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there are a bunch of things. Omar, would you want to talk about climate change since it does have a shadow over your book as well?
Sure. In the novel, a second civil war breaks out because the novel takes place in 2075. The US of 2075 is a very different place. The sea levels have risen. The eastern seaboard is largely gone. Florida's disappeared. There's Category 7 hurricanes, so on and so forth. And long after it would do any good at all, the federal government decides to impose a prohibition on fossil fuels to combat this. Even though by this point, the damage has already been done and most people have moved on to other sources of fuel, a number of southern states decide they'd still rather secede than go along with this. As I say this in this context now, I realize how this sounds saying it in 2017. When I thought this up, almost everything in American war exists as a kind of analogy to something else. And so when I was trying to think of something that would be an analogy to the first Civil War, I knew I wasn't going to find something of the sheer level of human brutality that was at play in the first Civil War. But as something that one day, many years from now, when it's safe to do so, we're all going to be able to look back and say, they were so wrong. I can't believe they didn't realize it. If it was me, I would have stood up and said something. That seemed to fit as an analogy. And this idea that many years from now, it's going to be safe to call this out for what it is and the damage that it's doing. But for now, it's not just this temporary aberration that one day we're all suddenly going to think better of and everybody will know better. It is the fuel behind one of the largest commercial empires on earth. And it makes a lot of people's lives easier, and for that we're willing to watch the ruin of other people's lives. And so that was the analogy as it played into the book. But then, of course, the book came out at a time when Trump, with one speech, set climate change policy in this country back 50 years, and suddenly was taken as a very literal thing. To me, I was thinking about stubbornness. I was thinking about this idea of, we do it this way because we've done it this way, and that means it's right. And so that's how climate change played into the novel.
Can I just connect that to what the sister said over here about, again, systems that actually do not benefit us, do not move our societies forward, yet again, we are hooked into them and believe that there's some value in there if we could just figure it out. And that, I think, is intimately connected to, again, the stories that were told about the dominator, like who's in charge and who has power and who gets to control that, which is connected obviously to so many things, and colonization is one of them. And I know Shashi's going to talk tomorrow about this, but really looking at, it was not just a cultural system, and it's an economic system. Who gets to control the resources and the land and the histories of groups of people, and justifying that, then that whole mission and that whole endeavor for hundreds of years set our economic order. And so that's still the economic order that we're dealing with. And we're still dealing with the stories that are connected to those people and those endeavors. And we still have not figured out, those are the rails that we're following, and we have to get ourselves off the rail. And of course, it's very easy because everything is oriented to just get us on that thing of like, no, don't think, of course, this is what is normally done. This is business as usual. This is the status quo. This is kind of, it'll make it easier. I shouldn't say this, or it'll make it easier. I don't want to cause waves. And now we have to derail things, like our brother over here was saying. And that is a very personal thing for each one of us. How do we derail the way that we've been socialized to participate in systems that do not value us and do not value our futures? And how do we then mobilize that? And I'm talking about theater, so how do we embody that then to enact in real life? And that's something each of us has to think about, and there's a role for each of us to play.
Yeah, I want to build on that, sorry. Because I think, you know, the question about globalization, for me, the first thing I thought of was language, because the automatic thing when we think of globalization, for me, is the English language, but that is not the global language. You know, the most number of people in the world don't speak English, but it is the language in which we all operate in the economic system, and it kind of reflects this system that we've signed up to without realizing that we've signed up to, right? And I often have people, I wasn't born in Australia, I was born in Sudan, and my parents migrated to Australia when I was a year and a half. And one of the charges that gets leveled at me all the time is you're un-Australian. You know, if you don't like it, because what I do is I try to critique our policies in order to make them better. And people are like, well, if you don't like it, why don't you go back to where you came from? I'm like, you know, that would be great, but colonization kind of screwed it up for me. But they're like, but that's so long ago, how does it matter? And it's difficult to explain to people who see themselves as individual actors not operating as part of a history, that they are not operating in a vacuum, that each and every one of us are operating as units of systems that are playing out histories, that it is not easy for a country to decolonize. Simply becoming independent is not decolonization. Because my aunties, they want to be fairer skinned, they want me to have straight hair, they want me to fit European beauty ideals, they want to speak English without an accent. These are not things that simply change overnight, and they're also not the way things should be. Right? And the question around what does globalization look like, what the ideal is, for me, it's not assimilation, where one power, one hegemony decides what it looks like for us all, but it is a utopian, for me, idea of pluralism, where everybody's different cultures and values are accepted for their difference. I may not understand why you do what you do, but I accept it. I accept you in your difference. I do not try to say, oh, well, you're just like me, therefore I'll accept you. I'm actually not just like you. Accept me anyway.
You know, I think one of the things I find is we use the word globalization so much in our discourse. I think we all have very different interpretations of what it means. It's a word easy to bandy around, but it means very different things for different people. If you define it, and there's no reason why you should define it, as the cross-border movement of money, goods, services, ideas, and people. There is no doubt in the past quarter century, there has been a greater upliftment out of poverty in Asia as a result of this phenomenon, which has occurred primarily in two countries, mainly in China, but also in India, which is precisely why those countries are for globalization now. In a way, they are not. They were not, before. We have to recognize that, globalization causes vast amounts of distress in some parts of the world, has also led to improvements in lives in other parts of the world. And if we think of a phenomenon like climate change, it is a true expression of the globalized world because it is everywhere, it affects everyone. And so it is, for us, it is here to stay. It is something we have to deal with, manage, but it's not going to go away in any form or fashion.
I think those last two comments are a pretty good note to end on, sort of utopian pluralism and the intractability of globalization. Here we are. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful audience, and it's been a wonderful panel.